In the name of one God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer of our lives. Amen. You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Why is Jesus being crabby there? I mean, it sounds like Jesus is being crabby. Like, of all the verses of this text, which is a weird text, there's a lot going on in this text, that's the one I didn't want to preach about. And sometimes you got to do what you don't want to do because there's some sort of gift in it. So that's what we're going to preach about, or at least that's where we're going to start anyway. And I realize, because it's troubling to me, like it's really confusing. Like, where does that come from? Jesus has just had what seems like a really profound spiritual transcendent moment on top of the mountain. And then all of a sudden, here he is out of the blue saying, you faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I bear with you and be with you? Like, what? Like, there's a man who is bringing his son who is caught up in, who has something that convulses him and throws him to the ground, and he's foaming in his mouth, and you hear a father's heart, right, of desperation, of wanting to save his son. So he brings his son to the disciples, and the disciples can't do anything about it. And then he brings him to Jesus, and that's where Jesus kind of gets reactive, right? And you faithless and perverse generation, like, who is he talking to? Like, when I hear this, you know, that crabbiness in that voice, I mean, quite honestly, I hear my mother's voice. And God bless her. I don't know what it was like to have to raise 4 children. Like, there were 4 of us, right? And I'm sure there were moments where you just lose it, and you're like, you kids, you rotten kids, you know, like whatever. Like, and that's the moment where you get scared and you start to have to walk on tiptoes because mom just blew up. That's kind of what this feels like. And is Jesus doing that? Like, it does feel like it comes out of nowhere. It feels like it's kind of unfair, which is what it felt like with my mother. Why? Like, who is he talking to? Is he talking to the father and the son? Like, the father's just trying to save his son. Is he, you faithless and perverse generation? Is he talking to the crowd? Like the crowd of bystanders who are just like watching it all and just curious and engaged? I mean, is he talking to the disciples? I mean, if he's talking to the disciples, why doesn't he address the disciples? Right? What you disciples, you know? I mean, they had just, at the beginning of chapter 9, so this transfiguration happens in Luke chapter 9. In the beginning of the chapter, Jesus sends the disciples out 2 by 2 to heal and set people free. Like, that's what Jesus is up to. That's the mission of the church, is to heal and set people free. And so Jesus has just done that and sent them out into the world, and they're supposed to be about this business of healing and setting people free from the things that oppress them, setting the people free from the things that kind of have them entrapped and in bondage and foaming at the mouth and convulsing on the ground, setting people free. And so this man brings the man with his child to the disciples, and they can't do it. But is that even really fair? So the disciples have been training to do this, but they're new at it. They've just started doing it. It seems unfair that Jesus is getting mad at them because they fail in this one instance. Like, oh, okay, we're not perfect yet. It's a confusing text to me. This whole thing begins prior to the Transfiguration. We don't read it, but right before the Transfiguration, what Jesus does is he makes his first prophecy. He says, the Son of Man must suffer, be rejected, die, and be raised. That's what he says to his disciples. I am going to suffer. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to die, and I'll be raised. And then, and that's where Peter says, God forbid that this should happen. In Matthew, that's what Peter says, God forbid that this should happen. But then Jesus says, and if you want to be my disciples, you too need to take up your cross and follow me. For everyone who loses his or her life for my sake will save it. So that's what Jesus says right before he goes up to the mountain with the disciples. If you want to follow me, this is a path that leads to a cross. It's a path that leads to death. It's also a path that leads to resurrection and leads to life. And so they go up to the top of the mountain. And Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, leaves the other 9 behind. And he goes, and they go up to the top of the mountain to pray. Because the tops of mountains are where people encounter God often. I mean, Moses was at the top of a mountain, right? When he was getting the 10 Commandments from God, he was at the top of the mountain. And when he got up to the top of the mountain, and spoke with God, he came back down and his face shone. That's what our Old Testament reading is about. When you're in the presence of God and God is full of light, you shine. That image of shining is a reflection of the glory of God. In Christian iconography, when you see the saints with a halo, that gold halo around their heads is symbolic of the glory of God. There's somebody who is standing in the presence of the glory of God or is near the glory of God, and they're reflecting the glory, they're reflecting the light of God back to us. Elijah was on top of a mountain. Elijah went up to the top of a mountain and discovered that God wasn't in the earthquake, and God wasn't in the wind, and God wasn't in the fire, but God was in the sound of sheer silence with a still, small voice. And so there's something about mountaintops. And I like to hike. I like to climb to the top of mountains. And I love it when I can get to the top of the mountain and there's a view, right, where the trees aren't blocking the view. That's a great thing when the trees aren't blocking the view and you can see. And when you get up there and you can see, and there's just this sense of space, there's this sense of light, there's this sense of awe. And that's why it's a spiritual experience, because whenever awe is a spiritual feeling, awe is a sense of something greater than yourself, of there being something beyond yourself. Awe is that experience that brings us into the sense that there can be something glorious and beautiful. So Jesus takes his disciples and they go up to the mountain to pray. Right? And I imagine Jesus, he gets in a posture of prayer, and I imagine he kind of probably kneels down, and maybe he's like this, maybe he's like this, I don't know. But I imagine he's there on the mountain just praying and being in the presence of God, and he is filled with light. His face changes, his clothes become white, there's the sense, and all that stuff about it becoming white is just symbolic of him being in the presence of God, filled with the presence of God. And the disciples are kind of up there praying too, but they're kind of groggy, and they look over and boom, they see Jesus up there with Moses and Elijah, who also have been on top of mountains, who also were in the presence of God. This is a super transcendent, kind of divine moment. And Jesus is sitting there talking with Moses and Elijah, or they're talking to him about his exodus. I forget what the word is that we used in the Greek translation here. It says it's his departure. That's what it is. Then our NRSV translates the word departure. But in the Greek, the word is exodus. It's the only time it's used in the New Testament, exodus. Referring to Jesus is about to make his own exodus. He's about to make his own journey, right out of oppression. That journey out of oppression and into freedom. And so there, Moses and Elijah and Jesus, there's this kind of communion that's going on. And Peter kind of groggily is like, hey, should we be building tents? Dwellings is how it's translated, but the Greek is should we be building these booths, these tents? Which the Jewish people do. There's a ceremony called Sukkot where They commemorate the wandering in the wilderness and God setting them free. And they go and they live in tents, right, for a period of time, for a couple of days, just to remember what it was like to be people who used to wander in the wilderness, who lived in tents. It's as if we all went a great big backpacking trip together and went camping and, stayed in tents. Like, that's what they do. Like, that it would be going there. And so that's part of what Peter's saying is, hey, should we be building tents? Is this part of the Exodus that we're doing? Is this part of the journey in this wilderness? And then the cloud overshadows them, and they're afraid because they can't see anymore. They can only hear, and God's voice says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And then there is silence. There's just this profound silence. And the disciples don't say anything. Then they come down from the mountain. And, the next day they're down from the mountain and they're with this crowd, and there's this father who has a son who falls and is convulsed by something that oppresses him, and the father is desperate to find healing for his son, and he brings him to the disciples, and the disciples can't hear him, and so he brings him to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Your disciples couldn't heal him," and Jesus says, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I bear with you?" And I hear Jesus being overwhelmed at the moment. I hear him actually being hung over from the spiritual high that he was on the day before, quite honestly. Sometimes that happens. You have like this really profound, upbeat, good moment, and then and things go really well, and then the next day you feel like, you're off, and you're like, what happened? Yesterday was so good. Why is today so bad? And sometimes that's just the cycle of things when you actually have some sort of high and then you go back down. And here Jesus is, he's back into the place of death and suffering. He's been on the mountaintop where there was being in the presence of God, and he's now back into the place of suffering. And I hear the frustration at that. I hear his own sense of overwhelm with that. He's knowing he's going off to die. And what he says is, you people who don't have any faith, gosh, why is it that you don't have faith? And that word perverse, like it's related to what a potter does when a potter is like casting a pot and the pot gets twisted or deformed as it's being cast in some way. And so it's kind of malformed. It's like it's not formed to its purpose. Like it's not set up for the purpose that it was designed. And Jesus is basically saying, why? You people without faith, you people who aren't living into being your true purpose. And the true purpose, like what is the true purpose? I was actually struck by the Corinthians reading. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. I was quite struck by it. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Spirit of the Lord. I mean, there's this sense that, gosh, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus and you're going to take up your cross daily and lose your life in order to save it, if you join into this process of death and resurrection, you will save your life, right? As you go up to the mountain to pray and enter into this communion with God, the God who is good, right? This God who is everlasting, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. right? That this communion with divine, gradually the glory of the Lord transforms you. As you unveil your face, right? And let the glory of the Lord transform you. You too will be set free. All of this is ultimately about being disciples, right? That phrase, faithless and perverse generation, is actually is a reference to the book of Deuteronomy, where God talks about God's exodus people, like God's people are in the wilderness being a faithless and perverse generation. We too are in our wilderness. This is our last Sunday before Lent, right? And we will be entering into a period of Lent, which is a period of preparation. It's a period of looking towards Jerusalem. It's a period of looking forward to Jerusalem, where on another mountaintop there will be a cross, where Jesus will make his journey to that cross and will come out on the other side with new life. As disciples, we are entering into that journey together. I mean, we will have our own, we're going to celebrate, actually, on Tuesday, for anybody who's interested. The men have just decided it's time to do a Shrove Tuesday pancake breakfast, or pancake center. So I'll make sure this is last minute, but we're going to make it happen. There's a good group of people who are like excited about it, and some people are like, whoa, this is way too late, or it's way too early in COVID. So I get that. But other people are like, yeah, bring it on, let's go. So we'll be celebrating again the end of, that's what this feast is. That's what Shrove Tuesday is this last celebration of eating fat and sugar and all those good things before we go into this period of preparation for the wilderness journey. And so we'll do that Shrove Tuesday thing here, and then on Wednesday we'll have a 9 a.m. and a 7:30 p.m. service where we will allow ourselves to have ashes placed upon our foreheads. And when I place those ashes on your foreheads, I will say, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Remember that you will die. There is death. And we make our journey in Lent. We experience the death on the cross. And then we come out on the other side, stepping into new life. And it's that process that transforms us and heals us and sets us free, so that we can be people who are agents of healing and freedom in this world. Amen.